problem with the term inclusion is that a kind of dominant culture is doing the including, is bestowing onto others, including and excluding. But you can't use the word belonging the same way. You just belong with others. The sense of belonging is one that we all understand. Worst thing you can do is to throw down the gauntlet and say, are you ready to teach inclusively? This is what riles teachers. I do feel that the discourse is important. There's an inherent problem with the term inclusion. It encourages tokenism, box ticking. I've included them. Oh yeah, we're okay because everyone is included. And it's not actually possible to include everybody either. You can be there, you can be present and certainly not belong. And that's something much more inherent. I think that has to be at the very center of all inclusive pedagogy, which is the enormous benefits that one gains from getting to know the other. That is absolutely inherent to the whole concept of inclusive practice.
What does inclusion or perhaps even belonging look like in practice for the average classroom teacher? How can a teacher know that they're not just ticking the box?
A lot of help has come from the universal design of learning. They have these 3 blocks of how we understand inclusive practice. It's basically
This is the Teacher Talking Time podcast.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? And welcome back to the Teacher Talking Time podcast. I'm Leo, and this is the show where we sit down with teachers, writers, educators, and researchers to talk about what actually works in language education. And today, we're joined by Ben Goldstein. Ben is a writer, teacher trainer, and conference speaker. He taught materials writing for years on the online MATESOL program at the New School in New York. He's also the author of 2 practical methodology books for teachers, Working with Images and Language Learning with Digital Video. And if you've used course books like Evolve or Eyes Open, you've probably already worked with his materials. His newest book, 30 Ideas on Inclusion in ELT, has just been published by Cambridge. And today, we're going to be talking about inclusion in the real classroom and what it means for the materials that we choose to create. And don't forget, if you enjoy these conversations, subscribe on YouTube and follow the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps us grow the show and help more teachers find us. And today's episode is presented by We Are English Teachers, a place for English language teachers seeking more students. The link is in the description if you want to check it out. All right, enjoy the episode, and here's Ben Goldstein. Ben, I have a very important question to kick things off here today. And it's actually a very simple question, but I think one that has a profound implications, I guess, for this conversation that we're about to have. And the question is very simple. Who are you trying to reach? What is the message you are trying to send or convey to them?
Yeah, first of all, I want to say it's great to be here, Leo. Thank you very much for inviting me. And it is a topic, inclusion, which is very dear to my heart, or has become so over the last few years. So in terms of the teachers that I'd like, the people I'd like to reach, it is everyday language teachers, not necessarily English teachers, of course, any language teachers, and teachers who may feel that inclusion is not for them. It's a strange topic. It's become so heavily politicized, especially in certain parts of the world, that people have many associations with it, which I think are not entirely positive. And so what I'm trying to do in the book, and what I'm trying to do in general, talking about inclusion to teachers and webinars and presentations and interviews like this, is really trying to demystifying inclusion and making it accessible for teachers. That's what I would really, that's really my aim at the moment, because I think there's so much negative press, and there's so many associations with the term inclusion. In fact, I actually don't love the term inclusion. And if you've read the end of I challenge and I suggest alternatives. We can talk about that later a little bit, perhaps. But I think there is a problem with the term inclusion itself that actually turns people off it.
Right.
And so for many reasons, and some of which we can go into in more detail today, I think it's a topic which is incredibly important, but which many teachers don't feel either able to deal with, or they actually sometimes feel a kind of negative response to it, or they feel a kind of sense that they're not doing enough. Yep. It's a bit like sustainability. I had a chat with a colleague of mine, and I was giving a talk when the inclusion was in the title, and he was giving a talk and sustainability was in the title. And he said to me, I think one of the problems maybe is that we include these big terms in the title, and the teachers think, oh, I know, this speaker is just going to remind me of all the things I should be doing regarding inclusion or regarding sustainability. And I think that's where the problem is. This idea that a lot of people involved in inclusive practice are often telling you off for not being inclusive enough.
Right.
There's this kind of discourse which can sometimes be quite aggressive and antagonistic. For various reasons, I think I see my role as one of making this topic, demystifying the topic and making it more accessible to all teachers. So I guess
I definitely want
to.
I definitely want us to go deeper into the topic and, as you said, try to demystify it and even understand a little bit more about what inclusion really encompasses. But I want us to rewind a little bit, and maybe perhaps you can walk me through the moment in your career, because you've been in English language teaching for a long time.
Yeah.
And perhaps you could pinpoint the exact moment when you realized, or when you came to the realization that English language teaching or English language or language education in general needed a conversation about inclusion.
Yeah. There was a specific moment, actually. I've taught in Spain nearly all my life. Over 30 years I've been here. But I did, for a brief period, work in Hong Kong for the British Council, the summer schools, which was something that many teachers from here did. And I remember there were a number of different centres that the British Council had. The main centre on Hong Kong Island was there were a lot of quite privileged teenagers there, as you could probably imagine. Very wealthy. They didn't really want to be there. They were very badly behaved. I had mainly taught adults. I hadn't had that much experience of teens. And so it was quite difficult for me. But one of the interesting things was that they all had English names. So all of the students, the Hong Kong Chinese, they all had English names in the main branch on Hong Kong Island, where they probably had travelled. Their English was quite high level in general and so on. And then occasionally I would get asked, that I was mainly based there because I was staying on the island, but occasionally I would get asked to do substitution classes in Kowloon on the other side of Hong Kong Island. I get the ferry over and so on. And I remember going to a school in Kowloon, I think it was Mong Kok or somewhere, incredibly densely populated part of Hong Kong. I'm walking in, and the usual thing with the register and the names and so on. Obviously, they are quite difficult for us. And anyway, I was taking the register, and one of the kids was reading them out, and I saw that one of the kids didn't have an English name. So I said, "Oh, so what is your English name?" And he said, "I don't have an English name. I don't want an English name." And all his colleagues started teasing him and laughing. Typical teenagers now. It's not cool not to have an English name and so on. And that was a moment, because I thought the teenagers are actually almost bullying me into forcing me
A little bit of
to
peer
give
pressure,
him, or
perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Looking to me to try and convince him to have an English name or to adopt an English name. And he held his position and wouldn't. And at that moment, I suppose that was a long time ago, 15 years ago or more. But I suddenly thought, it hadn't occurred to me. I just thought of it from my point of view. It's obviously much, much easier to refer to these kids with their English names, some of which they like and chose deliberately for a particular reason or whatever. But it hadn't occurred to me that the whole, you can imagine, the cultural associations of adopting an English name and the colonial narrative there and so on. And I actually stopped and I said, no, I actually said to her, look, if he doesn't want to have an English name, then that's okay. And I realized the onus was on me to refer to him as he wanted to be referred to. And that was a key moment for me, because I realized then that if I had done something different, then I would have been excluding him in a way from the class. And his sense of identity, his sense of self was bound up in that. And I suppose it's when you look at inclusive practice and topics like empathy and so on, which often get spoken about in relation to inclusion. One of the, I guess, most obvious things that novice teachers have to do is get students' names right. And it's a no-brainer, but it doesn't occur to teachers at the beginning of their careers. And yet I think it probably is the most, or one of the most important considerations in inclusive practice. But as I said, that was very early days in that, but it was a key moment, that I realized that the importance of agency, the learner identity, and all of these questions.
It's funny because as you were speaking about this, I think what really is insightful and striking to me is the fact there's no inclusion in ELT materials. And I was even thinking, like, even teacher, I don't think I can actually think of any teacher training courses, both pre-service or in-service courses, that include any sort of workshops or modules that talk about inclusion or inclusive practice. And now that you've described this very early experience as a turning point for you, I think what made you first realize that something was actually missing, specifically from the materials that you were working with? Because I believe that at that time you were using course books, and I also know that you have written course books in the past. So when was that moment when you realized, you know what, the mainstream materials that I'm actually using often exclude the very learners that you were meant to serve, right?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. That was something I learned very early on in writing materials. I've been writing materials for 20 years. That predates the turning point moment in Hong Kong, because in reality, that anecdote is really about the here and now of the classroom, isn't it? Teaching, classroom management, and so on. But what you're talking about now, of course, is other materials that we use. And I had a very early kind of introduction into that whole field, although we didn't talk about, it wasn't referred to as inclusion in those days.
Right.
Interestingly, I did a talk on the history of inclusion in ELT, in fact. And actually, nobody spoke about inclusion until about 2000, until about 10 years ago, 9 or 10 years ago. So there's that great big anthology of ELT, the Routledge Handbook of English Language Teaching, that Graham Hall edited that tome, where all the big names there, and they're all talking about incredibly important topics like learner topics which are related or could overlap with inclusion, like intercultural awareness, learner identity, this kind of thing. But the word does not appear once.
Really?
It doesn't appear in books like Scott Thornberry's A to Z of ELT, or because it wasn't on our radar then, DEI or EDI, however you want to refer to it. It just didn't, it existed in the workplace, but it didn't exist in it, and it existed in mainstream education, but it didn't really, it didn't really permeate ELT. I could talk about that a little bit later, because it is quite interesting because it's very relevant. How it is actually framed in our profession is very relevant to this whole debate about what we should do about inclusive practice, actually. But going back to what I don't want to go to digress too much. Going back to the materials, I learned the hard way in that I was co-author of a series for Richmond, which is a Spanish publisher at the time, and they're based in Mexico now, in fact, Santillana. So I was based here in Spain, and the book was an adult course book intended to be used in Spain and Latin America, Brazil, as well as the Spanish and Portuguese-speaking world. And I had an incredible amount of freedom. It was the good old days where it was really author-led publishing. Whereas this is the Ben Goldstein course, English language course kind of thing. I wrote 2 books just on my own, and my editor was very just, oh yeah, we trust you, Ben, entirely, just go for it. And I included an incredible amount of what was considered then, this word is not used now, but we could probably say it was taboo content.
Right.
And so it actually did really well, the course book, because it actually had content which other books didn't have from the big international publishers. It actually included gay couples and
Really?
marijuana and alcohol. Oh yeah, yeah. It was.
nice.
It's become a very actually, I say very famous. It's become an interesting case study, shall we say. So it's been picked up by queer theorists in ELT. A number of people have a couple of books behind me on the shelves there have
What's
used
the
it
textbook
because
called again?
it was
I don't
called
think I know.
Framework. Yeah, no.
Yes, I am familiar
Do you
with
remember
Framework,
maybe
yes.
in Brazil it did really well. I remember we got a lot of adoptions just because people couldn't really believe that this content was there. And I didn't make a big solo dance of it. I didn't talk about that. It's just I wanted just to show, as you said, students' realities as well, and not exclude anybody. I was very naive in the sense that it was very obvious. Some of there was even a spread and included an image of a nudist beach, and I think it was quite
Really?
it was quite radical. Yeah,
I don't think I remember. I am very familiar with the title of the course book, and I'm very
Yeah.
familiar with it. But I don't think I don't remember going through the pages of the textbook or even looking at the textbook
No.
to know exactly what it was talking about. But you're right. I feel like it was around 2015, 2014, 2015 when this
Or even
conversation
earlier.
about yeah. That's when I started
yeah.
noticing this pendulum swinging towards like inclusion and inclusivity in materials and things
Yeah.
like that. I have a question. I don't know if this is a politically correct question, but I know you talk about yourself in the book and about who you are as an author, biases, and I was thinking about your own identities because you were very, I think the word is, you were very open in the book you wrote by describing your own identities. And
Yeah.
Jewish, gay, male, white, middle class. I think to you, Ben, and this is again coming from someone who is not very well educated on the topic. Did your own identities shape how you thought about
Yeah.
representation and inclusion in ELT?
Yeah, the whole including gay content, including same-sex couples, just even not necessarily a photo, but just having a dialogue, perhaps two men or two women checking into a hotel room or something, the typical hotel, checking into a hotel conversation, the typical functional language and stuff. But just, as I said, not making any big deal about it, just presenting it as just another couple. There's something we did with Framework as well. We had other units where it was much, much more in your face, but a lot of the content was actually quite subtle. And the interesting thing about that was that because I didn't really finish the story of Framework, what actually happened was it did get censored because this publisher wanted to. We had some complaints for some religious schools in Mexico or some.
Wow.
But that didn't worry the publisher unduly. Big adoptions from adult institutions, people like Cultura Inglesa in Brazil or Británico in Peru or something like that, didn't matter too much. The problem came when the publisher decided that that the book was really quite successful. And so they thought, quite naively, they just said, why don't we try and promote this in Turkey? Or why don't we try and promote this in wherever?
Yeah.
And Poland or big ELT markets where a lot of these topics culturally are complex. And I had to bite the bullet and I had to self-censor. It was terrible. So that's what I meant about learning the hard way. But I think being gay, obviously that made it more acute. In fact, I just didn't see myself represented in any of the materials that people were producing. I thought it's ridiculous that there isn't a gay couple and Jewish identity is that it was not something that could be mentioned that easily either. Not that I was I had felt I had to always insert these, mention these identities, but I think having, let's say, two clearly marginalized identities, which is being Jewish and being gay, and I do feel very Jewish. My father was a rabbi, believe it or not.
Really?
And
Wow.
although a very liberal rabbi in London, it is very much part of my identity. It did, make a difference to how I went about writing materials, and I'm sure that was one of the reasons why I decided to do what I did. But I think it's an important question. The question of identities is important because this whole issue of intersectionality is very key in inclusive practice. But an important point to consider is that we have to consider our identities in all the multifacetedness, not just our marginalized identities, because this is one of the problems, I think. And this is where a lot of the time people in inclusive practice, people make fun of people. How many, different marginalized identities do you have or do you relate to?
Oh.
And it's, hang on a second, I may be gay, I may be Jewish, and these are maybe two identities which I consider marginalized because I have suffered some discrimination because of those identities. But I have far more other identities which are entirely non-marginalized.
Right.
And it's important to bear that in mind, because this focus on identity politics, right? This obsession with identity politics, this whole thing about, what was it, Bradley Cooper, and people are saying, when he played Leonard Bernstein in that film, and they put a fake nose on him, and then there people were saying, how can you do that? How can a non-Jew play a Jewish character and things like that? And you hear this again and again, no? How can a gay? You have to be gay in order to play a gay character in a movie or so. This is completely ridiculous. But this is the thing is this thing about this obsession with lived experience, yeah? So you can only play a Jewish character, a gay character, a Muslim character, a black character if you belong or you affiliate or associate yourself with that identity. And this to me is totally erroneous. So I think we need to consider multiple identities. And we also have to consider who we are, not necessarily associated with our identities. This is the problem with identity politics. Think about affiliation, think about tastes, think about things that you might have in common with someone which aren't necessarily related to your identity, but actually related to your tastes, interests, affiliations.
Yes.
See what I mean?
Yes. I feel like I was reminded, I don't know if you're familiar with Jonathan Haidt, and he's a great behavioral psychologist and researcher, and he wrote a very good book called The Righteous Mind. It's called Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. When you were speaking about that, I was reminded of one of his quotes, or one of the things that he said in the book, which is like what you were saying about, how many marginal identities do you have?
Yeah.
And it's funny because morality, it binds and blinds. It binds us into these ideological teams that fight each other as though the fate of the world is dependent on our side winning each battle. But it also blinds us to the fact that each team is also composed of good people who have something important to say.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I totally agree with you. And there's a lot. I've read a lot of books. I've read a lot about inclusion. And that's why the last chapter in the book is critical of the term inclusion and of a lot that's written about inclusive practice, because I ended up actually starting to get irritated by a lot of people working in the field. Precisely because there's a lot of self-righteousness.
Yes.
And this idea of slipping up, and people are surprised and say to me, I gave a talk at IATEFL last year, and it was a kind of I was anticipating the publication and so on. I didn't feel I could write the book without including a critical chapter at the end, because I've read so many bad books about inclusion, which are within an echo chamber, and it's just written for people who are just going to agree with everything that the writer says. That's preaching to the converted.
Yes.
And what we need to do, there's this kind of sense that everyone in language teaching must be on the left, Where did it come from? I've traveled all over the world, and I can tell you that maybe that is the case in some parts of the world, perhaps in Europe mainly, but certainly not in most of the countries I had worked in, and I've mainly worked as in Latin America. That's where I've actually worked the most in my career. And I come across people who are very conservative-minded. I don't want to, and I don't mean conservative, I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just people who are just more traditional, maybe just more conservative in their outlook. And to talk about inclusion in the way that it is spoken about to people like them, they're just going to switch off, because they just think that it is. That's when they say, I've had people say to me, it's not for me. It's not for me.
Exactly. And I feel like that seems to be the experience I've had whenever the word inclusion came to be, or came in a workshop at work. it was always, there was always these people who were very resistant because they kept saying, this is not for me, or I don't know how to apply this, I don't know how to do this. And it's funny because you included a quote. Actually, that was I eventually did some more research because I didn't know much about, because you mentioned a quote by Toni Morrison, and I think it's a quote that deeply resonated with you. And to a certain extent, it resonated with me because I feel, and I'm going to read the quote in a second because I want to make sure that I don't forget.
Yeah. No,
but I feel like you were using this quote, Ben, to like challenge teachers, challenge educators to this distance in their classrooms, because we have people who are pro-inclusion and you have people who are like, this is not for me. And a lot of people see inclusion as just ticking the box. It's not a and I feel like you don't want it to be just some sort of compliance or a policy. But the way I'm seeing now inclusion after reading parts of your book and also informing and educating myself a little more on the topic is that it just really is just, it's about being more empathetic. It's about connection or recognizing our interconnectedness, but also as a deeply human act of this connection that you talk about. So when you mentioned the quote by Toni Morrison, which goes like this: why should we want to know the stranger when it's easier to estrange one another? We want to close the distance when we can close the... And I want to go back to this because you think knowing the stranger is such an urgent task for language teachers.
Oh, it's absolutely fundamental to it's the D in the DEI, the diversity, the richness of the other, of getting to know the other. This is the idea that it lies at the essence of inclusive practice. It's often forgotten about, I think, because of the three, let's say the three, there are actually four or even five, but the three terms that are in the acronym DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or some that we'll talk about the others later, perhaps, if we have time. There's no real debate. Well, sorry, equity has to be explained, and inclusion certainly has to be explained. But diversity doesn't usually have to be explained, because what is diversity? Diversity is simply the multiple variables that you can have in any one class, I suppose, from socioeconomic, sexual orientation, ethnicity, religion, whatever, all the different disability and so on. And I think, I don't want to contradict myself, but I think that is a very important message, Leo, to strike home. I don't want to give the impression that the DEI people are just self-righteous and just talking to each other, but not being able to convince. That is true. And I think they do mystify it, and they do make it inaccessible for others. But there is one essential factor, which is the enormous benefits that one gains from getting to know the other. And that is absolutely inherent to the whole concept of inclusive practice. And I think that has to be at the very center of all inclusive pedagogy, because all of us have prejudices, whether we like it or not. And there's a whole chapter on that, on unconscious bias and so on. And I do agree with it, a lot of what people in the DEI world say about that, because it is absolutely true. When you really confront yourself and your points of the way you go about everyday life. When you look at someone in the street, all kinds of things cross your mind and you're sometimes ashamed of what you feel about the other, and you turn your back on them. We all do it, and we all have to admit that and fight against it. And of course, that and the politicization of it now, especially in the US, it is more important than ever. That we recognize, acknowledge, and celebrate the other. And but as you say, it's not necessarily rocket science how you do it. And I think that's one of the things I said at the beginning. The idea I want to try and make it more accessible. And you very rightly said that what you've been able to ascertain from your reading is actually that inclusive practice is being empathic, is creating a sense of community in class. It's giving your students agency. It's being your true self in the classroom. As I like to put it, I like to think of three sort of central ideas behind inclusive practice, and that is empathy, agency, and true self.
I've been talking to a lot of freelance teachers lately, as I do every day. And the one thing I keep hearing is how frustrating big platforms can be. We all know who they are. The low rates, the commissions, the algorithms, the lack of control, and in some cases, even having teachers work against each other. But working together, Abby, is how you and I met. And if you don't know, this is Abigail Fulbrook, the founder of weareenglishteachers.com. Abby, can you tell us what makes weareenglishteachers.com different?
Oh, yes. Of course, I designed We Are English Teachers for independent teachers who want to find students in their own way. So learners come to the site, they can search for teachers or courses and contact the teachers directly for free. There's no commission, there's no fee to contact the teachers. And the teachers, you can set your own prices, you manage your payments, you manage your calendar, and you keep every dollar that you earn.
I love that. It's really about taking back control of your teaching and of your own business.
That's it, exactly. And it's a membership as well as being a member and being listed in the directory. You get access to our community. It's called Elevate, and that has workshops, accountability, it has meetups and support from other independent teachers. So you get to meet people who are growing real businesses as well.
Incredible. I love this so much. So if you're listening and you're an independent teacher and you want to move away from those platforms that we mentioned, you want to get help finding, securing, and keeping your next English students and clients, go to the website weareenglishteachers.com and join Elevate today. That's weareenglishteachers.com. Abby, thank you for this.
Thank you.
So empathy, agency, what's the third one?
And true self.
True self. Yeah, can you break this down for us so we
Yeah.
know exactly what we're...
Yeah, so my argument is that actually a lot of what we do in class anyway is inclusive. What's happened is the framing has changed. As I said, that Routledge handbook from 2016, that doesn't mention the word inclusion anywhere, but it does mention words like empathy and agency and truth. It mentions concepts which are absolutely central to inclusive practice. It's just we didn't talk about it in those terms back then. It's only been in the last decade or so. But I think being empathic with your student, talking about yourself to your learners in a sincere way. This is all very humanistic, yeah? All belonging to the humanistic tradition, this idea of, I'm very much sort of afraid of the idea, the idea of breaking down the division between the teacher and the student and being participants in the classroom ecology. None of this is very new.
No, it's been around ages, yeah.
Exactly, but those are things that it's very difficult to disagree with. And that's why I really tried to hit home. I really tried to emphasize these messages in the book, because I think anyone who's been in the classroom knows that these things are important. And being empathic, allowing your learners agency, allowing them to feel that they belong in class, working out ways to do that, and being your true self with your learners, I think will mean that they will be their true selves with you. And it may sound idealist, it might sound a bit idealistic. It's a little bit, you could refer to it as the kind of culture of care, this idea of having a caring attitude above all else, really. Kindness and care should be the central pillars of this.
It's funny you say that, because I've been thinking a lot about that. Like, I've been thinking about education that comes from the heart, education that comes from of vulnerability. And I find myself, in a way, just being a lot more vulnerable with learners in the classroom. And I find that by being more vulnerable with them, by being more, trying to show them that it's okay to be yourself, to respect your identity and things like that. And I've noticed how much more we feel as a group. And the funny thing is that Paulo Freire has a book called Pedagogy of the Heart.
That's right.
Where he talks he talks a lot about, it's one of his latest books, and he talks about oppression, hope, faith. You also mentioned the word care. So there's a pedagogy of care, there's a pedagogy of the heart, which encompasses this idea of being more empathic. Learners develop a better sense of agency and just their true selves. But I feel like it all starts with the instructor. It all starts with the teacher in the classroom who needs to foster these things in the classroom. But then you were saying something here, Ben. I'm not quite sure I fully understand. But when you talked about inclusion and then you talked about belonging, any difference between inclusion and belonging? And if there is one, does that difference matter in any sense? I'm not quite clear on that.
Yeah. Before I answer that, can I just go back to what you said about vulnerability? And I will go back to it because that was I really wanted to pick up on that because there's an anecdote in the book. And I don't know if this guy, because he's Brazilian, he lives in Canada. I met him at MATESOL, Juan Lopez Reis. Juan Lopez, do you know him? Anyway, his anecdote's in the book. And I met him at MATESOL just after the pandemic, the very first MATESOL. Just to cut a very long story short, we were talking about teaching in Zoom during the pandemic and so on. And he just told me the story about how during the pandemic, how he was able to connect with his students. It was incredibly moving. And in fact, I've quoted I think it's in the chapter about empathy. I can't remember. It's incredibly moving what he told me. Because even in a Zoom classroom, which is quite dehumanizing compared to the face-to-face classroom, he just describes this moment where he'd had some losses in his family, and and he actually uses the term. He actually says, that's why I wanted to bring it up, because he actually says, I think we need to be more vulnerable with our students, because he did open up to his students at that point, and then as he did that, because it was at the height of the pandemic, they opened up to him. And so this was this idea of this sense of true self and not hiding those things when they are so important. And that really is at the point of need. When the pandemic was, that's what happened during the pandemic, that we shared this trauma. And it meant that without realizing it, our classrooms became quite different. And the role of the teacher became much more a kind of pastoral and a caregiver. And anyway, his anecdote moved me so much that I actually included it in the book. And because it shows that the importance of caring for and caring with your students and allowing yourself to be just a little bit more vulnerable, to allow them to talk about the things that are important. It was just a moment. We're not talking about classes turning into therapy sessions. I'm not saying that. It was a given moment in time when there was so much going on that was just too important to do page 96 or third conditional or whatever. And so I think that showed to me, and the fact that he was able to detect that, he'd obviously developed a certain community with his students, because if that was with adult learners, obviously it's not going to be easy to do that in other contexts. But I think this case study, this anecdote, shows the possibility of achieving that kind of culture of care in the classroom. But going back to what you said about belonging, yes, in fact, the whole end of the book is all about how actually belonging should be our end goal. It's actually really interesting how the word inclusion has become so problematic. So if you look at EDI now, I do an awful lot of work for Cambridge. The book's published by Cambridge. Their department is EDIB, so it's Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. Sometimes you'll hear JEDI, JEDI, which is justice, right? The B in particular, have you not heard that one?
No, so many acronyms to keep track of.
Yeah, actually, that is another problem in itself. There's so many things to talk about. Oh my goodness, because that also is an issue. The fact that it's an acronym is actually very important. But anyway, going back to what you said about belonging, my whole argument at the end of the book is actually that is what we should be aiming for. And why? Because the problem with inclusion, the problem with the term inclusion, is that it suggests that, to me at least, and I think to other people too, that a kind of dominant culture is doing the including, is bestowing onto others, including and excluding. Whereas you belong, I don't include, I include, I exclude, but you can't use the word belonging the same way. You just belong with others. The sense of belonging is one that we all understand, and something which evolves over time.
I never thought about that. Yeah, it's a very good nuanced way of describing the difference between the two. Yes. inclusion is almost like a sense of ownership, and you are
That's
the one,
right.
as you said,
You're
bestowing.
bestowing.
Yes.
This term bestowing is
You
important.
have been granted with inclusion.
Yes,
now.
exactly. You're included. And of course, as we all know, apart from anything else, the great truism is, of course, that, you can be included and not belong. You can be there, you can be present and certainly not belong. And that's something much more inherent. Yeah. And this is the problem with inclusion, as you said a few minutes ago as well, is that it encourages tokenism, box ticking.
Yeah.
I've included them. Oh, yeah. We're okay because everyone is included. And it's not actually possible to include everybody either. It's a kind of it's actually rather counterproductive to think of it in those terms. So for me, it sounds a bit fluffy, maybe airy-fairy. Yeah. I don't want to be, the touchy-feely or whatever. But I do feel that the discourse is important. And I think there's an inherent problem with the term inclusion. All you need to do is look at how, as I say, companies have included the belonging into the acronym. Or Michigan, for example, university, which is at the forefront of inclusive practice in the States, have changed their department. They're no longer called, I can't remember what it was. They don't use the term inclusive teaching anymore. They refer to it as equitable teaching.
Equitable teaching.
Yeah, have a look at the website. It's fascinating. They actually do a kind of history of Michigan University and how the inclusion 2.0, 3.0, and it's all rather vague, the reasons that they use to justify these changes, but we all know this is happening all over the world, that the word inclusion is actually is complex. And what I meant to say about the acronym is that the other problem with the acronym is that it gives the impression that it's something extra, like it's something, have you done a bit of DEI? You know what I mean?
Yes.
As if it was DIY. But the whole point is it shouldn't be seen as something, as an option, as something extra that I'm going to do a bit of inclusion now or a bit of EDI. It has to be, it's much more profound than that. It's much more inherent than that. It has to be there always. And I think that's another reason why belonging is actually ultimately a better term.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Equitable teaching. I actually like that.
I
just found the website here. I just found it here. It's Equity-Focused Teaching, University of Michigan.
That's right.
And it's like basically providing needs-based support to ensure equitable learning opportunities. That's what the website says. But you just touched on something that I wanted to explore a little further, because you were talking about like this idea of describing inclusion as trying to change the system to actually fit the student. But what does that look like in practice? What does inclusion, or perhaps even belonging, look like in practice for the average classroom teacher? How can a teacher know that they're not just ticking the box? How can they know that they're actually being equitable in their teaching?
Yeah, I think a lot of help has come from the UDL in this respect, Universal Design of Learning. You're familiar with that?
Not really. No.
Okay. UDL. Okay, so that's really important.
You mean the universal learning
Universal Design of Learning. Yeah.
Yes, UDL. So that one I'm familiar with. Yes.
Yeah, that's about that came about 2019, and that was really important because that sort of broke it down in a really clever way. And so they have these 3 blocks of how we understand inclusive practice. It's basically the engagement. How do you engage students? So that's the why. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this in class? Then there's the representation, the what, the material. And then there's the action or expression, which is the how. And how are you going to do it? How are you going to produce your work? And that's such a useful framework, because if a teacher comes to me and says, how can I do it? It's a very good question, Leo. How can I actually apply this? I often turn to the UDL, because I say, look, first of all, you've got to get learners engaged in a topic or in material. Otherwise the students will say, why are we doing this? So multiple, and so this is what the UDL that's the essence of the UDL is the whole concept is to offer multiple opportunities and multiple choices for the learners. And this is we go back to agency again. And the teacher has to think, how do I engage these learners? How do I engage them? I can present the material this way, I can present it that way. How are my students going to best to it or best get engaged with it? And then it's what they produce. And then it's how the representation exactly and what is represented and the way that you represent that, which is very important. And then how they respond to it themselves, the action. So I'll give you an example of this just to maybe, because I'm aware that you're in Canada, and this is another anecdote from Canada, actually, and this is also in the book. And this will explain a little bit about, I think it's a good example. So have you heard of Tanya Pattison?
Yes.
Yeah, so I went to a talk by her at IATEFL a few years ago, and she was talking about the fact that she lives in Canada, and she had to teach material related to the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, the whole issue of these indigenous children that were the history of this, that were removed from their homes and they were sent to these special schools, a kind of ethnic cleansing that went on for decades in Canada. As part of the curriculum, of the inclusive curriculum, she had to, there's a Truth and Reconciliation Day, isn't there, in Canada, I believe? And
yes.
So on. So she had to actually include this. And she felt terrible about it. She actually said, I'm not Canadian, I'm not Indigenous, I'm not even Canadian. How do I even go about how can I do this in a sensitive way? So it's like, how do I engage? So first of all, she had to think, how can I engage my students with something which is very traumatic?
Yes.
Remember, she had no choice but to do it. This is another thing about inclusion. It's on the curriculum.
Yes.
And she drew up a list of she wrote an article for IATEFL Voices. In fact, she wrote it up and I quote it in the book. And she doesn't actually refer to the UDL, but she basically reflects on the same questions. Yeah, this is the material. I've got to engage my students somehow, but it's a very traumatic topic. How do I do it? Why am I doing it? Because I'm told I have to do it. In this case,
yes, there's a little
exactly in this particular case. That was the why is clear, but she had to think about how could she engage them in it. It's a very sensitive issue, very traumatic issue. She went through all of this: the why, the what, and the how, and she had to create material for the students to use and to reflect on in class. And she drew up a kind of list of a series of guidelines for, she referred to it as material on traumatic issues.
Okay.
Well worth checking out. I can send you the link. It's from IATEFL Voices from a few years ago. And she says something very important, which she worked out that the only way that she could really refer to this terrible atrocity in a sensitive and non-tokenistic way was to find a spokesperson, somebody who had actually suffered that discrimination, and someone who's now adult, obviously was a kid at the time. And so she uses a case study approach. She uses the words of a person who suffered as a result of this. And it's obvious. You think about it. There's that famous phrase, isn't it? Don't talk about us without us. No, this idea that
never speak about us without us.
Yeah. This idea of the first person. So you don't want a third person outsider looking on and giving that perspective on a topic like this. She realized it had to be coming from the first person.
Yes.
And so she found that case study, and then she talks about different ways that she gave the students choices for how they wanted to receive the material.
That's nice.
Yeah.
That's
so this
nice.
idea this is another big area in inclusive practice, this idea of giving choice. Yeah, is a key.
I think, don't you think that to a certain extent, we need to be very flexible in the way this material is going to be delivered? Especially if I work with a lot of students who are newcomers to Canada and they're taking college classes, and a lot of them are coming from places where they're escaping a war. There's been some trauma back home.
Oh, God.
And
Absolutely.
I feel like to a certain extent, we need to somehow take cues from how students are reacting to those things. And I feel like that's where the flexibility comes in. I feel like that's what she was trying to achieve with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think the thing is that it is complex for people who have suffered trauma. They may well not want to talk about it or even refer to it. And if you talk about a topic like this, it may upset them, it may trigger things, all of these things. And there are lots of guidance in the book about that. It really is a question of getting to know your students. I don't know how many students you have in class and how many are perhaps in this position that you described of people who had come to Canada running or leaving because they were oppressed or because of war or whatever reason. But obviously you have to be very aware of anything that can trigger emotions which students may simply not want to reveal in class, and they have every right not to reveal them. But at the same time, one of the things she says, Tanya, in this article is you shouldn't sugarcoat the material, right?
Yes.
So don't make it, and this is something that ELT has always had a tendency to do, in my opinion, this idea of the legacy of the communicative approach. Let's all play a game, or let's make light of everything.
Let's have fun. Let's have fun.
Let's have fun. I hate that because adults is patronizing for adult learners.
It is patronizing.
Yeah. And let's talk about things. I'm not saying we have to talk about very serious traumatic issues every day. Of course not. That's not going to be fun either. But we shouldn't hide away from things. The world there are terrible things going on in the world, and they need to be spoken about. But there is obviously a time and a place and a way to deal with it. And I think that this comes with experience. Obviously, a lot of these things, it's very difficult to say this is a recipe for dealing with this issue that we've just spoken about in Canada. Of course, there's no one way. It's a question of you. That's why her case study is an interesting one. It's a particular context, it's a particular class, and she worked out a way that she felt happy with for dealing with this material. And for that reason, it's a very good case study. But it does touch on this, going back to your initial question, how can I make this accessible? How can I make inclusive practice accessible? Just look at the chapters in the book, things like offering choice, this is an absolute fundamental of inclusive practice. And yet it's been around for decades, the idea of agency, allowing learners to, in the case of action and expression, to respond how they want to respond, in a video, in an audio, in a text, and
I was taking some notes here, and you were talking about, I feel like we've touched on Paulo Freire, we've talked about intersectionality, and reading parts of the book, I could easily sense that you were drawing on some very deep critical for the writing of the book. Yeah. But again, these are also ideas, Ben, that make people very uncomfortable. Recently, when I mentioned that I was going to be interviewing you and I was going to ask certain questions, I feel like people were triggered by the things that I wanted to talk about, especially because I think it's because inclusion has been framed more as a political stance. And I feel like a lot of the people that were offended by what I said perhaps saw me as a very specific type of person that belongs to a very specific political identity. Yeah. In your work, or based on everything, all the research that you have done for this book and everything that you know about the topic, why do you think inclusion in education has become so polarizing, even among teachers?
Yeah, I do think it has a lot to do with identity politics. This is why it is so heavily politicized in the States. I don't know what the extent to which it is in Canada, but I don't think anywhere as much. Hopefully, as not as much. And I do think that it is this sense of always you're always going to get it wrong. You're always going to trip up somehow. And I think it's the problem. I think a lot of the problem comes from the tertiary sector, from the universities themselves. So the problem, there's a lot of trivialization. All this language, all these acronyms that often are invented and coined by university teachers, I don't know, the people of color, POC or BIPOC or BAME.
SEN, yes.
It's SEN. That's something we need to talk about before we finish the SEN. That's very important. People are just going to think, I don't know how people worry about how they should refer to other people, but they're going to slip up. They're not using the right term. They're not using the right acronym. People say, is it okay if I say, hi, guys? Hang on a second. This is distracting, actually. This is not benefiting us. This is walking into their walking into to the right. It's the way they make fun of the inclusion brigade, isn't it? The inclusion police, they call them. They say, oh, you said that, oh, you said that, oh, you tripped up there, oh, you got that wrong. Oh, and I think that's a problem. I don't think it matters that, as I said before, I don't think it matters that Bradley Cooper plays Leonard Bernstein. I don't think it matters that people say hi guys and not hi girls.
Yeah.
I think that fundamentally all of that is distracting us from the important issues, which is what you like, the importance of knowing the other, for example, the importance of empathy. These foundations of inclusive practice that get overlooked sometimes because we're too distracted with policing language.
Yeah. Is that why? Because you were writing, there was a section in the book where you're writing about and how they can, and you've just talked a little bit about this, how they can be both helpful but also harmful.
Yeah.
And what you're just basically saying here, from my understanding, is that we shouldn't just abandon these labels, but we just have to be more critical and more careful when we use them.
Exactly.
So then the question then becomes, why are these labels like special needs? Or I've heard a teacher in a school, like I go to parent teachers meeting and I see teachers talking about, oh, neurodiverse. Like, why do you think these labels can be somewhat double-edged swords in inclusive practice?
This is what you touched. This is something we did need to talk about, and it is related as well to the history of inclusion and inclusive practice in language teaching, because fundamentally, when I embarked on the challenge of writing this book, fundamentally inclusion, what had been published about inclusion so far had been in just two fields. In SEN, special educational needs, of which there was a lot has been published, and in materials. And somebody like Tyson Seaburn in Canada again has published a book on writing inclusive materials and so on, and I used his book a lot as a reference. But these two fields are very different if you think about it. Yeah. So one is very much referring to classroom practice and the possibility, the variability that you may have in class of students who are neurodiverse and so on. And the other field is entirely to do with representation in materials and so on. What I wanted to do in my book was just to have a completely holistic approach and a whole person approach. So a person-led approach, not a label-led perspective. And move away from those labels. Is
that why you talk about like person first language, like for example, person with autism, and I think you use the word identity language, or like an autistic person?
Yeah, but it's not. Yeah, I didn't coin those terms. Those terms exist. So it's like saying I'm an autistic person, a person with autism, and that's absolutely, you have to ask the person concerned which of these terms they prefer, because it is important.
Yeah.
But going back to the relationship with SEN, this is really crucial, because when I first wrote the proposal for the book, actually the reviewers, because Cambridge sent it out to reviewers, and they just didn't get it. They actually wanted, Leo, you won't believe this, and it's not, I don't think Cambridge will mind it. It's not Cambridge, it's the reviewers who actually looked at the material for the first time. They looked at the material and they said, oh no, hang on, this is too wide lens. I don't see that we need to have a chapter on neurodiversity. We need to have a chapter on LGBT identity. We need to have a chapter on refugees. We need to have a chapter on Black identity. I was going, but don't you see that as soon as you do that, you're just creating more categories and excluding? But they just saw it as too unwieldy if you don't do that. And I said, no, and so I redid the proposal. I did take on some of the criticism on board, and I redid the proposal, but I kept to my holistic approach. But I do think it's really important. What is very important is that, I don't know what the percentage, a very high percentage of teachers in language teaching really only consider inclusion to be related with special educational needs. In actual fact, the IATEFL group, the last special interest group to be created was in fact the IPSE, it's called IPSEN, Inclusive Practices Special Educational Needs. In other words, there was a direct correlation, a direct association between inclusion and special educational needs. And that group still exists. And I personally don't have any problem with the term special. For me, it's not a good term, special educational needs, because I don't think we should be treating students in a special way. But the term is not going away. It's like these acronyms, they don't go away. They're very ingrained in society. What is changing, though, is that in the latest material on language education and neurodiversity, there is not so much reference to specific neurodiverse conditions or dyslexia or dyspraxia. There is much less of that now. They talk about neurodiversity in general, and I think this is helpful because I think one of the problems is that a lot of these categories, there is no one student who is the same. In other words, there are many students with ADHD who are also dyslexic. There are many students with autism who also have ADHD. And it's too complex and too personal, actually, to keep labeling and saying, this is how we need to deal with ADHD students. This is how we need to deal with dyslexic students. I'm not saying that there are plenty of workshops, people online promoting themselves as giving guidance to neurodiverse learners. And a lot of what they say makes total sense. But a lot of what they say would make total sense for any learner. And so my argument in the book is that being clear with instructions, breaking down activities into small chunks, using color, using more images, these are things that we know are really important for neurodiverse students. But they're also going to be absolutely okay for other students, neurotypical students. And so my argument is that what we don't want to do is to create, because that goes back to segregation. We don't want to create activities only for a certain group of students in class. That's the last thing we want to do. The difference in focus is simply that for a neurodiverse student of any kind, these differences, I don't know, as I just said, chunking activities, giving very clear instructions, using more visual aids and so on, these things are fundamental for those students, whereas for neurotypical students, they're just going to be important, but for them it's fundamental, and that's the key thing to remember. But my book, there is no specific, I don't feel qualified, Leo, to talk about. I am not an expert in neurodiversity. And it's impossible and that's another reason why people say, how did you write a book on inclusion? Of course I can't be an expert in all these fields. It's impossible. Yeah. But having done the reading and having looked and having seen what experts, practitioners in these fields, I've taken what I feel are the important methodological, pedagogical, the most important pedagogical advice, and said, but if you really want to find out more, then please turn to a more specialist course.
It's very interesting how you framed that, because in the book I noticed, at least, I didn't read section B, which is the activities, section C, a lot about the activities, but in the book I've noticed that you used, at least the sections that I read, you used the word strength a lot. I don't know if you've noticed this, but
that's interesting. I hadn't noticed that.
Yeah, I noticed that. I noticed there's a lot of strength. So I think what I'm thinking from a practical perspective is, how can a language teacher, how can teachers in general shift away from a diagnosis-based type of teaching to this strength-based, identity-aware pedagogy that you talk about?
Yeah, okay, so I understand now what you mean by strength. So the idea the whole idea of these deficit labels now.
Yes.
Like ADHD itself, the fact that it's got the word disorder in there, and we can't, special educational needs, these are all deficit labels.
Yes.
Actually. And they don't do us any favors. It is important to know at least a little bit about these neurodiverse conditions. Even I'm trying to policing my own language here. I'm not sure I should be saying conditions even, but there's no end to it. It is important to not refer to students' difficulties always, but rather their strengths. And so, for example, in the case of ADHD, we can refer to hyperfocus. Yeah, so the fact that that many people with ADHD are able to focus incredibly well on a particular area, for example.
Myself included.
There you go. And so this is something that I did want to bring in, but this is also related to what we said about getting to know your learners on multiple levels. And obviously that's not something that's going to happen from day one. It's something that you'll develop throughout the course, however long you're with your learners. But it's very important to consider students on multiple levels as well, and not consider the way you talk about students to them and also to colleagues as well is very important. And not just always referred to, oh, that ADHD student I've got,
Yes.
or always looking at the sort of deficit, always looking at that to classify the student. So the student is only classified in that way. There may be that particular student is ADHD, but they may also have a great interest in a particular topic or something, that you can bring out in class. And so that the students begin to see them as somebody else as well, not just the person necessarily with this category. So the important thing is to appreciate variability, variability in class, but also variability within each student and their particular strengths that may not be apparent at all. And this is just something that you develop by, just it's common sense, I suppose, once you've been in the class for a long time, talking to students in the break, before, after. I said, I noticed that you seem to be very interested in this topic. So tell me more about how is it that, or your family background, is that why you suddenly took an interest in that? I noticed that you mentioned the such and such. Just taking the student aside at one moment and just asking them, it could easily be, if you're able to speak, obviously I have the advantage that I've always taught in monolingual context. It's not your case. I know it's not the case of many of the people who watch these programs. But obviously, if you are able to speak in their own language as well, then that's also a fantastic way to get to know students on a more profound level. I think fundamentally, whether we're speaking about learner variability, there's so many perspectives, whether it's neurodiversity or ethnicity, or nobody really talks much about socioeconomic. That's the one people talk about the least, and which is also very revealing. That's the one people forget about. Now, maybe the reason that is because it is actually possibly more difficult to tackle that in some ways, but it is another thing that is important to consider.
Oh, absolutely.
And I just think, I look back on my life. When I was growing up, I had all kinds of problems with that, because all of my colleagues all the families were much more sort of middle class than mine, and had bigger houses. And whenever I invited them round and to my house, and we ate a certain kind of food that I would consider working class food and things like this. And I actually hid it and things like that. And all kinds of things I did as a teenager, because I was hanging out with people who I didn't think belonged to my social class. And it's staggering, these things that are really important. But obviously, one is not going to, I just throw that anecdote in there because it just suddenly occurred to me. There's something that I could have put in the book, actually, but about my own lived experience. So there you go. But I think the important thing is that it's impossible for us to get to know our learners on the multiple levels that I think would be desirable. But we just have to appreciate that it's all to do being sensitive to learner variability and curious about the people in front of you, people in the room with you, and appreciating more than I think than teachers did in the past. That's why I mean that the framing has changed, because we've always spoken about empathy. We've always spoken about intercultural awareness. I talk about intercultural awareness quite a lot in the book. And this is a way by referring to these topics, it's a way that I try to help teachers demystify inclusion, because I say a lot of what you're doing is already inclusive. Because a lot of what we do as language teachers, by getting our learners to talk about themselves, express themselves, it is essentially inclusive. That the worst thing you can do, and I've heard speakers talking about inclusion, is to throw down the gauntlet and say, are you ready to teach inclusively? Are you ready to create this safe space where every single person in class is valued? Are you ready? I don't think you are ready. This approach is this is what riles teachers, because because you're throwing down an impossible challenge. But do you know what I mean, Leo? People talk like this.
I'm usually turned off by that.
Exactly.
That's the kind of stuff that really turns me off, because I think
it's the wrong message.
Yes, I think my vision of inclusivity, especially after this conversation, has definitely taken a much better, well-defined shape now. But I feel like, as what you said, I feel like a lot of teachers, especially if they're approaching teaching from a pedagogy of the heart, a pedagogy of care,
Yeah.
I feel like they are already being inclusive by approaching education that way.
Exactly. I think the other very key thing, I think, and this is a key quotation in the book from the OECD, is this, and I think this is a recent sort of change in classification, is moving away from the individual to the community. So inclusive practice before, and I still hear a lot of inclusive practitioners talking about this, that it's all about learning. It's all about, and I myself may have just said it without realizing, it's all about all the individuals in the room and their variability. But it's absolutely impossible to focus on the individual in the way that a lot of inclusive practitioners encourage us to do. At the end of the day, I think we need to meet the needs of every individual, but it's not about differentiation anymore. It's about creating a sense of community within the class where everybody feels that they can contribute, rather than the teacher going, oh, look, I've got to address this because this student is this. I've got to address this because this student is that. I've got to address... No, it's all about appreciating that variability and deciding, okay, how can I get everybody to feel that they belong here with me? And there are lots of ways which are, again, as I said, not rocket science. So that classic activity, the creating the classroom contract, for example, that's a brilliant way to... It's solid gold, that it really is. I mean, it's a brilliant way to create a sense of community, getting different people to contribute different clauses to the contract.
Yeah.
And considering it as a kind of fluid sort of document that can be changed, that new clauses can be introduced, others can be tweaked and so on. And that really is giving learners agency. And yet that idea of classroom contract has been around for forever.
Oh.
But again, it's framing it again in a different way. Yeah. And it's including clauses which may, with an inclusive tweak to them. So for example, if you disagree with a person's point of view, challenge the argument, don't challenge the person, whatever. Yeah. Things like that, which maybe not rocket science, but it's really important it's a great way for teachers to really enter into dialogue with their learners on the same. It's very Freire, I think, the idea of this community, isn't it?
Yes.
Of a shared responsibility.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, what you said in the beginning of our conversation about leading with empathy, helping learners develop a sense of agency, and just teaching from a true self perspective, I feel like all of that will, in a way, help build that community in the classroom, especially when you have students from vastly different backgrounds, because as you said, you can't really accommodate everyone, but you can make sure that together you have this community. And before I have one or two more questions that I wanted to ask you. I was reminded of a conversation I had with Sarah Mercer. I don't know if you're familiar.
Oh, yeah, of course, yes.
She does a lot of work with psychology of language learning. And I never forget what she said about real engagement and fake engagement. The moment a teacher is more vulnerable in the classroom, the moment a teacher really tries to focus on this idea of building community, giving their learners a better sense of agency, that's when you start experiencing the real kind of engagement in the classroom, as opposed to the other one where it's just fake compliance. It's just compliance. It's just complying with you.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, it's a tokenistic approach. They're just sort of going through the motions maybe but you can't fake it. And I think we've all witnessed that at times, if you do teacher observations where maybe you can tell when it's real and felt and when it's forced. But as I said, I don't think it should be, my big argument is that it shouldn't be seen as this challenge. I maybe use the word challenge in the book, I don't know, but I think it's important that it's very important. I say in the introduction that it may well be that some of the things you read here are some of the things you do already. And I've hammered that home a lot in this interview, but I do think that's really important because I do think that is a key way for teachers to to find the topic more accessible, because it's like saying, actually, I didn't, okay, I'm doing this stuff. I didn't actually realize that was inclusive. That's just how I teach. You know what I mean? And
Yes.
I think that these labels are very dangerous. And this one in particular, as we said, because it's so politically charged, people really get the wrong end of the stick. Another way that I think I talk about this at the beginning of the book as well. Another key way to make it more accessible and to encourage empathy is just to look at the definition. Maybe it's something we could have said, talked about in the first 5 minutes, but of how do we define inclusion? And it is all about the removal of barriers to learning. And this issue of barriers is absolutely fundamental.
Yes.
Because, and I think a very good way to get teachers to understand that is just to say to them, just think of the barriers you've had to face in your life.
Yeah.
Think about maybe not necessarily barriers to learning, but barriers to living. You know, what barriers have you encountered? Have you overcome them? Maybe some of those barriers you may not even have overcome yet. And if you did overcome them, how did you overcome them? Because just reflecting on that and your experience, I think will inevitably help you empathize with other people's barriers that may seem incredibly different from yours. By putting yourself in the position of, and that's why I think the definition of inclusion is so helpful, the notion of barriers. Another way to make it more accessible.
Yeah, we didn't get into that very much, but I remember there was a section in the book where you talked about, I think it's the DFG Douglas Fir Group.
That's right, yeah.
You talk a lot about, it's a framework where you're looking at the meso and the macro level.
That's right.
But I guess if people want to learn more about that, they're going to have to buy your book. They're going to have to buy the book. Because if we talk about everything here, then they won't buy the book.
Exactly.
Which leads me to the last question that I wanted to ask you. If we were to fast forward, let's say it's 2035, yeah. What do you hope? Because it's funny, because we said inclusion is relatively new in English language teaching, and now the conversation is in vogue. It's like everyone is talking about this now. But if we fast forward 10 years from now, do you hope the conversation around inclusion in English language teaching looks like?
I certainly hope it's not as politicized as it is in some parts of the world, and that it is seen holistically and not in limited ways. I think the inclusion is too complex to just talk about it with reference to, for example, neurodiversity or with materials, representation in materials. Of course, these things are incredibly important, but my book and my sort of outlook it's an attempt. It's quite a daring attempt to frame this in a holistic kind of whole person way. And so I suppose I'd hope that in 10 years' time that was understood, because at the moment it really isn't understood. It'd be interesting to see the reviews that it gets and if people get the approach, because also the book itself, because it's these 30 ideas, I can't go into massive detail about these different fields. Because of the nature of this, a kind of pocket handbook. So I do refer to more specific sources which will go into more detail. But the idea, in some ways I like the fact that it has that format, the book, because it forced me to really get down to the basics, the fundamentals. Right. And I suppose what I would like to feel is that if I've been able to contribute in some way to making teachers' understanding of the topic kind of more holistic, then I've done my job, or I've certainly contributed, because I do feel that we should be talking about it in that way rather than in multiple ways that it's spoken about, which may be alienating for teachers.
Yeah. That's great. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoy this conversation. Ben's new book, 30 Ideas on Inclusion in ELT, is out and available. I think it's by Cambridge Handbooks.
Yeah.
There
it is.
Yeah, let's see. There you
go. I have one here. Yeah.
Oh, nice. There you go. So it's part of the Cambridge Handbook for language teachers, right? The handy pocket-sized ones, yes. So,
that's right.
Ben, thank you very much for coming on the show. Really,
it's been a pleasure,
honestly, yes, I'm leaving. I'm signing off here with... I still have lots of questions. Unfortunately, the podcast cannot be 5 hours.
No, of course not.
But I really hope that we're not just here focusing primarily on materials, but we also, I feel like the conversation really around a little bit of presence, possibilities, And I think for everyone who's listening to us, I think in your own teaching context, I think that I'll leave everyone with is, what does it mean to close the distance between you and your learners in your context?
I think it's a nice way of putting it. We'd love to get your feedback on that. So thanks very much for the conversation. It's been great. I've really enjoyed it. And, hope we can collaborate on something else in the future.